Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video, I'll give you a general introduction to the unconscious. Now, this video will focus on the personal unconscious, mainly, let's say. At the very end, I'll give you a little teaser on what the collective unconscious according to Carl Jung is. And there'll be another video where I'll give you a brief introduction to the collective unconscious. Now, I want to limit this video to something between 5 and 10 minutes, let's see. So I'll be brief in most of my explanations, and there are many other videos on this channel you can find on this and similar topics, but I really wanted to give you a brief interlude. So let's get right into it. The personal unconscious is essentially not something that is there when you're born. Now, the personal unconscious is also not something that is, let's say, just a repository for that which you don't know or don't remember. Those are not the definitions of the personal unconscious, at least according to the Freudian school, so the psychoanalytic perspective by Freud and later Lacan and so on. Now, in the realm of psychology or neuroscience, we may say the unconscious, like simply that which you do not remember, would be termed in this Freudian and Lacanian view that I'm drawing on today largely, and Jungian view certainly, of course, because Jung, as a student of Freud, followed his definitions of the personal unconscious to some extent as the subconscious. So that's simply which you don't recognize, that which you don't know. This may be, let's say, a stimuli that are hitting your brain, your eyes all the time, or your ears, your sense organs in general, that you simply don't notice for multiple reasons, right? Perception and sensation are complex pathways, and you don't notice or perceive everything that you sense. Now, the fact that the unconscious, the personal unconscious, is not something that is there from the beginning on raises the question how this unconscious comes into being. So why do we have an unconscious and why do we care about it? I think that's probably the most important question at the beginning. The reason why the unconscious emerges is because there is certain, on the personal level, okay, we'll get to the collective later, but on the personal level, there are, let's say, moments or elements in your life that you cannot process or that you cannot, let's say, integrate into what we call the ego. Now, the ego essentially, and this is now sort of a Jungian / narrative psychology perspective of it / my own interpretation, I guess. The ego is sort of the narrative, the kind of story you tell yourself and other people about who you are, about what you are. I always think of the ego as sort of the photo library in your phone. You know, you can look at pictures, and those pictures somehow make sense and hang together. And precisely the question how they hang together, this is what your ego is, right? Not necessarily the pictures. You don't own them. That's none of your sort of business. They picture something else. They're representation. But the way they hang together, the narrative, the act of narrating and projecting into the future, that's the ego. Now, there are certain elements that the ego cannot deal with, and there are many sort of formative moments in this process that especially Lacan develops in depth in his work, having to do with sort of the relation to your mother, the relation to sort of your father and the mother and the father. So sort of this relationship between the child when it's quite young and its parents plays a key role in the formation of the unconscious. But I think this goes in too much depth now. Essentially, the formation of the structure occurs in childhood and then later becomes develops a life of its own, if you will. Now, this life of its own is limited to the extent that the unconscious always pulls on the ego. Now, the ego, again, remember, it's this narrative about yourself. And in being this narrative about yourself, the ego is in essence also the kinds of actions, the kind of reactions you display. Now, this already tells us that the ego is not at all controlling itself, right? Because it's always pulled and pushed by sort of these unconscious forces, right? That's what we call, let's say the desires that someone has. You don't know what you desire, essentially. Knowing, in this case, being related to the ego. It's sort of driven, this desire is driven within the unconscious. Now, again, the unconscious develops this life of its own, which is essentially to say that the unconscious is let's say, it is formed, it is shaped, it is put into place, comes in formation in a way that sort of makes sense, that follows an internal logic. And this logic, according to Lacan, later that developed Freud's work, is the logic of a language. Now, we also don't have time to go into that, but essentially I think one more point is quite essential to mention, and that is the point, so what is cast into the unconscious. Now, what is cast in the unconscious, I think, is essentially the wrong question, because anything could become part of this unconscious, right? Any utterance, any linguistic structure, but also other structures like smell, like voice, like, you know, stuff you hear. But most essentially, I think the question is, why do certain contents become part of the unconscious, or the personal unconscious? And the answer to that is that there is a relationship between those contents that become part of the unconscious and sort of these first moments of the formation of the unconscious. Now, there's always sort of a relationship between those, and this relationship can take the shape of stuff like repression or displacement. And now, with that, let's turn to sort of the final teaser that I promised, and look at the collective unconscious a little bit, and just briefly contrast it to these conversations about the personal that we had. Now, the collective unconscious is a hypothesis that Carl Jung put forth. Carl Jung was a student of Sigmund Freud, and Freud essentially was sort of the one that Lacan interpreted, let's say. Now, Jung went a different route. Jung also recognized the existence of the personal unconscious, but he said there's another realm, sort of another layer below that is much more significant to the study of the psyche. And this layer is the collective unconscious. And this collective unconscious, as opposed to the personal unconscious, is present at birth. Essentially, what Jung proposes is that the ego, or consciousness, rises out of the collective unconscious like the light emerges from darkness, or like in a creation story, perhaps, the land mass emerges from the water. The collective unconscious is not personal, as you may guess, but is instead the repository of the entire human history. And this entire human history, or the way this information is stored in there, is by a way of forming sort of the trajectories, the kinds of pathways along which the content on the level of the ego can unfold. Now, as I said, there are many more videos on this channel about the collective unconscious. In fact, that's what we deal with. If you're interested in this kind of material and you want to read into it, do consider to go to the description, enter your email address in a link there, where you will receive a free reading list that's quite extensive. It contains readings on Jung, as well as Freud and general psychology. If you're more interested in this, you can consider going to my website and buying some books, or looking at the books, and if you're interested, purchasing them. Now, I think one final word that I want to utter here is, why should we be interested in studying the unconscious? And I think it has become quite clear here from this very brief video that we are not in charge of ourselves. Now, the ego, that is we, is essentially simply a compartment of the whole. Now, this doesn't mean that there's simply stuff that I don't know about, stuff that I've forgotten, but that there is literally areas, forces on the collective and the personal level that have a structure and that exercise an influence upon that which I think is me. And this, what I think is me, is not me fundamentally. And now this is why I would recommend you to sort of take a closer look at these aspects of yourself at the collective and the personal level, although I think the collective is sort of more, it's more different from what we used to think about. Thanks a lot for watching this video. Do consider to leave a like and subscribe if you liked this video, and of course leave a comment and let me know what you thought. Bye-bye.